wants to be king!
Over the weekend, I came across an article talking about some parents in New York that were feeling threatened because some white kids had made a video talking about the Triple K rising again and threatening to Willie Lynch black kids in the school. And while I read about the selective outrage that was being exhibited by these parents and these students, it made me start to ponder something that I've been chewing on really hard for the past couple of years, really since the whole St. Floyd incident took place. And I've witnessed how they're blatantly lying about everything that has to do with these black martyrs that have been used to push a narrative that has been pushed over and over again in this country. Hit the reset button, if you will. You know, I think it's kind of poetic that pretty much every video that I've made that has gotten me hitting in the strike zone is either dealing with the issue of the race division or calling attention to the lack of accountability and just the foolishness that's taken place with women. There's sacred cows that you can't talk about, no pun intended. There's certain things that you just can't speak of because they'll say that you're being hateful and propagating these things that I've never propagated at all. I'm simply one to call everyone to the mirror of self-reflection. If you have a true quarrel, if you have a real complaint, I'm all for people seeking justice. I'm all for people getting what's due to them. But going through the liberal quagmire that we're this narrative that has repeated itself in my lifetime, this time for the second time as an adult, I've noticed the game. I see the game, and the same narrative has been spun time and again. And because the inherent victim mindset that seems to be in the DNA of black people, it works. It works to the point to where black folks end up in a worse situation than they started. You know, my grandmother, I've often sung her praise because when I was a young man, when I was in the 8th, 9th grade, I was listening to all the other victims, the kids that were reciting the narrative that they were taught at home. And because these were Section 8 recipients, these were welfare families, it was always someone else's fault that they were in the situation that we're in. And because we were all in the same boat, because most of us shared a similar experience, it seemed to be normal. But my grandmother, lucky for me, she was raised in a time where she saw something drastically different than what we were being taught. And my great-grandmother, her mother, she was an example of where my grandmother came from. The gap that was closed in just a simple generation from my great-grandmother to my grandmother. And the way she got where she was with the help of white folks. And so when I tried to blame my shortcomings, my failings, when I tried to use that narrative, it was quickly checked. When I tried to come home and speak the narrative that they were giving us at school, she educated me differently. And she told me the truth. And the truth of it is, her very simple truth was, most black folks are lazy. And most black folks will sit back and blaming the white man instead of putting their nose to the grind and doing what needs to be done. And any narrative that was spun, you know, you got to work 10 times harder, she would just flip it and say you'd be 10 times better then. Just do what you got to do. Whatever obstacles are put in front of you aren't put in front of you by the white man, it's put in front of you by God. So don't blame him for your lack of your willingness to get over it. And those messages at the time, it sounded stupid. It sounded like she was blaming me for my status, and she was right. But it took a long time for me to realize that. It took me going through life, getting life experience, and thinking for myself before I could detach myself from this group thing that seems to be so pervasive. In the past couple of weeks, I've received several videos from some of the guys who have subscribed here for a while. And the common narrative in all of these videos is a bully brutalizing a child that looks different than them. And it's justified. It's not vilified as it should be, because it's retribution for what happened to the ancestral bloodline and all of this bullshit. And it is being allowed. It's being allowed in many places. It's being celebrated. In places that are run by Democrats, the blue states like New York, that have allowed these criminals to go free because they're the victims some kind of way. These people that have been soft on crime, these people that have done nothing to cure what really ails these communities, they're surprised now that there's blowback and there's white children that are tired of being called oppressors. They're tired of being blamed for things that they had absolutely nothing to do with, and their parents had nothing to do with, and their great-grandparents had nothing to do with. But this narrative keeps popping back up over and over again, and this recent iteration of it seems to answer a question that I've had for a long time. See, because I couldn't understand the racism that I experienced as a young man. I went to a school in Texas, and I got called nigger by teachers. I got stood down in the hallway by groups of kids, and the teachers did absolutely nothing about it, because it was in a town where there was no black people there, and I had no help. I had no one there to save me, to help me, any of that. I was alone, and it was horrifying. It was a horrifying experience, but in dealing with that experience, it gave me a sense of an armor. But I couldn't understand why my white friends were forbidden to hang out with us, to play with us, and we absolutely couldn't go in their homes. And you know, when we brought that to our house, it was always because we were black. It was, oh, they're racist. It was always this, you know, it was the same narrative. The evil white folks think that they're better than you, so that's why they treat you that way. And so I went about my life believing this narrative. I went about my life, even though I'm a zebra, I believe that white folks were just inherently evil and they looked down upon me, and I carried that burden until I realized that people are people, and it's really a matter of what your character stands for. It's what you are as a person. It doesn't have anything to do with your color. And the idea that we're going to have some utopian society where there's going to be equality and balance is asinine, because that simply cannot exist. There is no utopian society. This mixing pot's going to come with differences, and blaming slavery on white men when it was just something that happened. People have done this since people started warring with one another. It's not the white man's creation. That's just what human beings do. And luckily, my grandmother gave me the grounding. She planted the seeds of that, so when I got older, I could see what I was dealing with. And as I was, got matured and dealt with why my friends' parents were looking at me the way that they were, I came to learn they weren't looking at me. They weren't judging me per se. They knew my father. They knew my uncles. They knew all of the gangsters and the hoodlums that made up the men who raised us. And usually children don't fall far from the tree. So to mitigate anything happening inside their house, anything being stolen or any criminal activity, they simply made a judgment call and said, I don't want you playing with those kids. And as I got older, I came to realize that those parents weren't prejudiced. They were good parents. Maybe they were prejudiced. They judged the situation based on the fact that children usually end up like their parents. And so I got older and started to understand that. And I think that a lot of people in my generation started to understand that. But if you roll it back, if you roll this whole situation back and you ask the question, why? Black America in the 50s they were outpacing everyone in the country. Families were intact. They owned businesses. They owned property. All of these things were in black folks' favor. Black people were thriving. They owned part of America. But something happened. Something happened, and then there was a chasm that was created. But I've come to realize that this whole game, pitting one against the other, this is the tried and true divide and conquer. The people who truly control things, the people who control the money system, it is imperative for us to be fighting one another. It's imperative for there to be a ruling class and a class who is oppressed and the victim class. If everybody comes together and has a sense of harmony, then we'll all collectively realize that we're being screwed over, we're being toyed with, we're being enslaved with this idea that we're supposed to waste our lives away so these people can benefit. When I look at the civil rights movement as an adult now and think about the things that my grandmother was telling me when she explained that a lot of the things that I was experiencing with white kids and the way that they saw black folks, it was because of the Martin Luther King people, she would say. And I didn't understand that then, but I understand it now. Because we celebrate this man now as if he was a hero, but in his time, he was despised. They made him a hero because he had a dream of this collective unity of black folks insisting on going into white places and populating them, holding hands with little white girls, all of that stuff. Black America should have never done that. Black America should have stayed where they were. They owned property. They were farmers. They had a vested interest in this country. But they traded that for this idea that life in the city, working in a factory, getting conks and wearing zoot suits, becoming pimps, city players, getting involved in this demonic system was more important than raising families, being invested in this country. And when this hornet's nest was rattled in the 50s, we got all of the turmoil of the 60s. And then the 70s babies had to suffer the ramifications of that. And that is what's going to happen now. With everybody at every point, POCs constantly berating white folks for their failures or whatever their idea of how their life should be, blaming people, taking this opportunity instead of building their community to say what they feel like they never could say to Whitey. These children are watching. These little white children are watching and listening to their parents field these assaults. These parents are getting angry. And when the collective gets tired of being belittled, berated, and bullied, when they get tired of their children being dumped on their head at school simply because they're white, their daughters being beaten by boys simply because you disrespected me on the bus, when the men get tired of their children being assaulted this way, we're going to roll it all the way back. And the children that come next will suffer the same thing that my generation suffered. And it will be at the fault of the people who are crying foul right now. America should do better. But unfortunately, we're built out of entitled losers. And because of that, we're all going to suffer. Out.